Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols, and our guest today shares a key item in common with comedian Jerry Seinfeld, their love of Superman. One widely known bit of trivia is that Jerry has included an image of Superman in every one of the 180 episodes of his hit television show, Seinfeld. In our case, author Eddy Zeno has a passion for the people who produce the artwork for the comics, the comic strip, and promotional items. He's produced two previous books that are both fascinating and lavishly illustrated with artwork and stories that take the reader behind the scenes, biographies and remembrances from veterans in the industry, many of them offering appreciations of the pioneer artists who came before them. Those previous books are Curt Swan, A Life in Comics, Al Plastino, Last Superman Standing, and now his latest, Drawn to Greatness, Wayne Boring and the Early Superman Artists Who Followed Joe Shuster. We're very pleased to welcome author Eddy Zeno.
Thank you.
How did Superman become part of your life?
At age 7, I had an attack of appendicitis, wound up not needing surgery for it, but I was in the hospital for a couple of days. And I remember, I guess my parents would have been the ones to bring me some like little Lotta comic books, that sort of thing. And it wasn't long before my brother and I, he's 2 years older, started collecting, and we wound up loving the superhero comics. And they also taught me to read and gave me a much larger vocabulary than I would have had otherwise at that young age. But there was something very special about the artist on Superman and Superman's adventures in Action Comics. And it was not until years later that I found out from a letter column that it was someone named Curt Swan, whom I wrote that first book of mine. He was the subject, and we became friends over the years, and which is one reason this is the greatest hobby in the world, because these people were accessible, and almost all of them were humble and nice and surprised that there were people reaching out to them as fans, because that didn't happen very often back then. And in fact, the editors didn't want the artists to know how popular they were, because they'd ask for a pay raise. So that's the love of Superman came out of that special connection to the art and the moral values that the character taught. He's been criticized as the big blue Boy Scout, but we didn't think of it like that. A lot of kids my age, we learned from him about right and wrong, and we also learned about life and death through some of his heroic exploits. So that's a long version of
truth,
of your
justice,
nice question.
And the American way. That's
in the American way.
Yes, exactly. In fact, in one of the illustrations on this current book, you have one where Superman is talking to a group of people and saying that we don't exercise prejudice against anybody, no matter what they are. And that's the American way. And I think that's one of the really outstanding things that came out of that.
So true. And, there were some gangster connections, mobster connections to the publishers that went into comic books and even DC Comics. And they needed to turn their image around, and they wanted to turn their image around, and they wound up doing these public service announcements. And what you quoted from that drawing was done, it was on book covers, and it was a poster, and it was an example of them trying to turn things around. Well, maybe it was to stay out of jail and to sell things partly, but it certainly turned out to be a great thing.
I have to ask, because this is an extraordinary book. You've got artwork or photos on every single page. And how long did it take you to do the research for this?
Each one of my books takes a number of years. This one, I lose track, but I would say between 6 and 7 years. I have had a great designer for all 3 of those books, but I find the art and we work together. So I'm telling him sometimes where to place it, but sometimes he's deciding where to place it. His name's Jeff Weigel, brilliant graphic designer. And but yeah, I'm searching, always searching for artwork because I want to tell two stories in each book. I want to tell a story by text, and then I want to tell, provide a lot of additional information through the art.
Mhm. How cooperative were the people at DC when, I mean, you're publishing all of this stuff that's copyrighted by them.
And that's a problem with the third book. The first book, I was told when I contacted DC to ask their permission that that was the Kurt Swan book. Um, the quote was, "You'd better get a good lawyer." So
Uh,
it started out like that, but it was only to warn me that don't be a jerk and don't do something detrimental to the character into DC Comics, because when we presented it later to them, the same person was fully on board and even later wrote an introduction to one of my books. So it was, that was what the threat was for, was because they didn't know who they were dealing with, what I would do. So they were very agreeable. But over the years, it depends on the administration at DC Comics, and it changes. It has changed often. And
so you have to reacquaint yourself with them or them with you?
yes, either that or hopefully find a publisher that has a good relationship with them.
Yeah.
But the third book, the one that you're interviewing me about, publishers at this point are very afraid that DC would come down on them. But I've always sought an attorney, a copyright attorney's advice, who says you're okay to use this the way you've done it through the fair use laws.
Mhm.
But it still scares publishers. And I had one publisher go to DC, and DC wanted a large fee to allow the book to be published. So when you ask them, that kind of thing might happen. So this third book that you're interviewing me about will see form in a magazine, an alter ego magazine, rather than in a published book. Though I always self-publish some copies because I want to see it in book form.
Uh, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to see this because I will have to say I drooled over every page.
Thank you.
One of the really delightful aspects of it is page 5 of this book, right at the beginning. You show a 4x7 grid with 28 different Superman and Superboy artists. It is a triumph of research and editing. And I showed it to my wife, and she said, "That is awesome." And she's not a big comic book fan. So,
Oh, well, thank you. And that page, I can't take credit for that. That was the graphic designer's idea. And he took images from the book and did that, and showed it to me. And yeah, I thought, like you, that it was fantastic.
yeah,
So again, Jeff Weigel deserves a lot of credit for that and other things.
right. You were able to enlist a number of articles by contributors who worked in the industry, so it isn't just your writing throughout this whole thing. How did that go?
Certainly by by this third book, it went well. Once, so when I did the book on Kurt Swan, the first book, and I started asking professionals, I knew that I wanted to talk to get people that knew him personally, that had known him for many years longer than I had, and knew him in a different way throughout his career, whether it was in the military, that they knew him, like Andy Rooney, or as a golfing buddy like Mort Walker, of Beetle Bailey fame. I wanted these people to contribute, and the only way I could do it and my conscience be at ease, since these people were not making money off this thing, was to donate the proceeds from the book for the first 5 years to charity.
Oh,
So that made me feel better, but also because Kurt Swan was so beloved in the industry, these guys didn't hesitate to help a perfect stranger in almost every case. So after I had the credibility of the first book, it was much easier on the second and third book, sometimes involving the same professionals, sometimes to reaching out to other ones that knew the artist. Once you get a little bit of credibility and you're known as someone that is good to your word and honest, which I always strive to do, to be, all of that makes it, it gets easier as time goes on for those reasons.
And I think, now I have to say that I was a comic book person in the 60s and 70s. So, and I was more Justice League than I was a Superman, but he was part of that. And I had my share of all the other ones. But I was thoroughly impressed not only by the depth of your scholarship, but the breadth of it, because you didn't just do the pencilers and the inkers, you did the letterers, the embellishers, people who did the background. It's also the only discussion I've ever seen in a book about speed lines.
Yeah.
That's wonderful detail.
Well, thank you very much. It makes me feel good. Because I never know if something like speed lines is too esoteric, but yes. And, when I start these books, they always turn out to traverse, they go much deeper than I expect, because I learn about, okay, well, I've got to include the letterers because they were interesting people in themselves, when I didn't start out even thinking about doing that. In my first book, I didn't think I was going to be interviewing so many comic book writers. I was only interested in interviewing other artists. So, and then that would have been a huge mistake. So, bumbling and stumbling into these things, they take on a life of their own, as so many authors say, and they tell you, if you listen, which way to go. And again, it just has to be done, and eventually I figure that out. But always, I'm not very good at following an initial outline and sticking to the plan. So part of it's disorganization that leads to those sorts of wonderful moments.
Wow. We certainly appreciate it as fans out here. But to be able to realize that it's been 85 years since Superman debuted, and the scholarship and the research to find out who did what to whom, particularly when there were artists that traded back and forth. I'll do the inks on this one, you do the pencils, and then we'll swap for the next. Getting that all pulled together, and in some places you say it's not really sure, but we think this is what happened. I appreciate that a great deal.
Well, thank you. And if you're familiar, and I'm sure you are, with the Grand Comics database, where they list artists and writers, I found halfway through doing this book that you're interviewing me about, that they had made some major mistakes. And part of the reason they found that out was someone eventually read Jerry Siegel's court records from when they sued DC to try to regain total rights and ownership of Superman. And he had kept, written down who did what, and there were some major errors until that time. So I had to go back and at least 50 pages, scour them very close and figure out, and it even led to some things that the Grand Comics database had not discovered, to have to change things. So it's an evolving thing with the credits. But we do know so much more than we did 20 years ago. And yes, I felt it was very important to pull some of this together and to correct a couple of things, but the database is fantastic overall.
I think you just became a major contributor to it.
Well, indirectly, yes, but I would be pretty certain that in another 10, 15 years, or maybe sooner, we'll find a couple of errors in what I did.
I also want to point out to our listeners that you went beyond talking about an artist only in the DC universe. You included things where they worked on other comic companies, where they worked in comic strips, where they did commercial art, even fine art in there. And that's why I say every page has artwork or photos, and it's eye candy. Let's put it that way.
The funny thing about the origin of that, going back a book or two, is some of that is because, again, of trying not to just put DC art so that DC would come after me with a lawyer,
Yeah.
but to show, represent many other companies and as you said, fine art and advertising art, magazine art, things that are not related to DC. So that, again, that's a happy accident because now I wouldn't have it any other way. And when I do these mini biographies, I don't sometimes include, I do sometimes if I think it's relevant, like if a child is interviewed of one of the artists, but I don't include every detail of their life, but I do try to hit, I want people to feel like they know them still while covering so many people. I want to give a sense of who they were and what was very interesting about them while not covering every detail of their life. So that's kind of tiptoeing around in maybe a little bit unusual, but yeah, I've had a great time doing that. And yes, I love to hit other aspects of their career and sometimes to find out how it shaped the way they did Superman or why they left the character and maybe even came back. It's all part of a grand story.
I think one of the aspects of it that kind of surprised me was to discover that original artist Joe Shuster for a long time did the faces, even if other people of Superman, every other people drew the bodies and the rest of it. I thought that was intriguing.
Yes, because of his failing eyesight from even by the time Superman was accepted, he was already having vision problems, and he had a problem for quite a while drawing with his hand. He had an injury that made it difficult to draw. So Jerry Siegel, the co-creator and writer, wanted the look to be. He felt only Shuster could capture the soul of Superman. So and Joe, wanted to be involved as much as possible. So he did draw some stories, he did layouts sometimes, but he did try to ink the faces, not pencil them, but ink them over other pencilers to create that Shuster look and give Superman his soul for the first 10 years of the life of the character. But I found that I don't accept the fact that he inked all the faces and maybe not even most of the faces. I think the actual artist did based on studying the styles for so long. Shuster did what he could, but I don't think he was either available or if it was an artist that didn't work directly for him, that he didn't ink the faces. So he did in some cases, and it does make it harder to identify the artist sometimes, but he didn't always do it.
Interesting. You also point out structurally that Siegel and Shuster set up their own company, stable of artists and writers that contracted with DC, and then people go back and forth. They'd work for Shuster, they'd work for DC directly. Sometimes they go back. Fascinating to track all of that stuff as well. You must have
Yes.
a giant spreadsheet somewhere with all of this on it.
No, instead, again, part of the disorganization, I have millions of little Post-it notes with things on it, and I'm lucky when I finally get to throw some of them away to have less. But no, my spreadsheets are, part of the book. Like when I list all the birth dates and death dates and try to put things together there, but not so much. I do want to say very quickly also, I want to give a lot of credit to when you mentioned them having their own shop, their own little school, the Shuster shop. That was hit home. It really became clear to me to make that a major part of the book when Mel Higgins, who originally had the idea for this book, but as you said, how hard it is to pull all of this together. He had interviewed some of the relatives of these late creators, even people that were no longer alive by the time are not able to be interviewed by the time I took the book. But Mel deserves a major salute, and that's why his name is on the book also, for having the idea and him being, the Shuster shop. You got to talk about the Shuster shop and what is a comic book shop. So credit to Mel.
And that was not in New York, though.
Right. Siegel and Shuster did feel obligated. They moved to New York very briefly after Superman was becoming a sensation. But in 1939 already, they moved back to Cleveland, where they were originally from. But then Joe Shuster, the artist, moved back to New York when Jerry Siegel went into the military. So Shuster moved back in 1943. And some of the artists stayed behind in Cleveland. One particular artist did not ever want to live in New York, so he quit assisting on the character once he got out of the service because he didn't want to move there. So there was some back and forth. But yeah, the shop was known, certainly in Cleveland, is where it gained notoriety, and some major magazine articles were written at the time where they were interviewed in Cleveland in this tiny little office that they rented, barely big enough for a couple of artists besides Shuster to be in their drawing.
I think one of the quotes I was reading a little bit earlier said it was really a size for two, but they put three of us in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There are things in here that would be news to everyone but the most hardcore fans. And one real surprise for me is that before co-creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster launched Superman, they had a fanzine in which the character, the Superman, was a villain and not a hero. What
Right.
a weird piece of trivia that is.
Yeah, there was a magazine years ago, Nemo, that published this fanzine story where Superman looked like Lex Luthor. He's bald, the Superman he was called, and he was this evil genius, a guy trying to take over the world type of thing. And then so they decided when they wanted to bring this character back and put him in newspapers that he needed to be a good guy, and that's when the changes started to occur. But it's interesting to me too how long it took them to come up with a costume. He started out as a hero in an undershirt, a sleeveless undershirt and pants. That was the first Superman as a hero drawing. It was a little while before they started to put a circus type costume on him.
And again, for those of us who are into the trivia bits, you notice how the S changes on his chest and it moves down for one artist and back up for another one. And it gets on the cape for another one. So incredible detail in this.
Yeah, and that helps to identify, who did what. They didn't put an emblem on the cape until a year later, a year after the character started being published, and that was by an artist named Fred Ray, who also has a very interesting life story. And he did comic books to give him the money to be able to do historical booklets for national parks. So there's all kinds of great backstories to what happened when.
Right. And again, for those of us who are into the minutest of trivia, I noticed that early on, Superman Kal-El was Kal-L and later changed to Kal-El, which is what I knew it as, growing up in the 50s and 60s. Interesting change. I suppose somebody said this is more easy for people to pronounce in their head. You should put that vowel in.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard the story of how that changed, but another one is Mixtious Pitalik, the famous little sprite. His name was just misspelled later on, and so that became the spelling of choice over the years. So sometimes it happened like that too. And then supposedly Luthor, who started out as a red-headed villain, how did he become bald? Was it an error on the part of an artist who drew a henchman and called him Luthor instead of Lex Luthor? Now we don't really know that that's true necessarily, and I talk about that in the book, but some of these things, again, were just accidents because people would forget what they'd done the month before or what another artist or writer had done.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Wayne Boring, because he's the main chunk of the book, and I am impressed by the number of people who got to write pieces and appreciations of him. So it's a really nice piece.
And most of the professionals had always admired Wayne Boring and knew a lot more about him than the other artists. The only one that gets quite a bit of coverage from the pros besides Wayne Boring was an artist named Win Mortimer.
Yeah.
One reason those two got more professional quotes was they were around longer. They went well past the golden age of comics. And Wayne Boring was the Superman artist for 29 years, one of the main ones. And so much more, greater longevity than the other artist. So he went into these people's childhoods that now might be in their 50s, 60s, 70s even. And that's why he got the most quotes. But in a way, I always consider this two books in one, because it's a book about who drew Superman during the first 10 years when Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were still actively working on the character also. And then Wayne Boring, because my previous books had been about individuals, Kurt Swan and then Al Plastino, the third guy that needed to be covered because of his longevity and great contributions was Wayne Boring. So there's a 50-page encore about Boring's career after we go through the first 10 years and talk about everybody else, and Wayne a little bit too. So two books in one is which is kind of again, unorthodox and unwieldy, but that's what I wanted to do.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you did, because it's fascinating. And you got people now, a lot of the names that people that quote were insiders in the industry, didn't have much publicity, but I recognized a few, like Roy Thomas, whose career extended into my comic book writing, and Ron Goulart, science fiction author as well, who also did a lot of comic work. That's kind of cool to contact those folks and get them to. I have the feeling that there was not a lot of persuasion involved. They were happy to write about these.
They were happy to write, but sometimes it has taken them sometimes up to 2 years to get some of these guys to have time, because they want to do a good job and they want to think about it. So they're very busy. So it takes, again, that's an endeavor that takes a lot of patience. I enjoy it. I don't mind that, but I know now, I learned over the years, hey, this guy, if I keep after him, but gently, and give them time to get their other things done, but don't let them forget. It may take 2 years, but they'll do it eventually.
You also, interesting, you kind of accent when different characters started to appear. John Cicala, Jimmy, was really Jimmy, and then later given the name Jimmy Olsen. Other people first wanted to do Lois Lane, etc. Those are kind of interesting milestones for people.
Yes. And it was interesting to discover that Lois Lane had her own little feature in Superman comics for a while around the war years. Kind of comedic stories with more cartoony style. That was a lot of fun to see that. I think that might have happened when they actually had to shorten. So during the war, they had to shorten the page count in comic books because there was a paper shortage. Yeah. And I can't remember now if that's when that went away or if that's when they decided, well, we don't have room for a full-length story, so we'll add a little short Lois Lane story. Yeah. And Jimmy Olsen, of course, he was first, I think, on the radio scripts, where he got his last name, and Kryptonite comes from the radio show, the name Kryptonite, rather than the comic books.
And you think about, here's the comic books, you've got the comic strip, you've got the radio show, you also had movie serials and movies, all kind of interacting sometimes, and I can see an artist or writer going, hey, that's interesting from that. Let's take that and see if we can work with it here. And for 85 years, coming up with new stories about the same bunch of characters has got to be tiring.
So tiring and so tough. And you remind me that, one of the asides in the book, besides the Who Inked the Great Speed lines, was, bringing in a little short chapter about the animation, about the animated
Yes.
Fleischer Studios Superman,
Yeah.
and a comic book story they did where they actually showed film strip on the comic book page to try to mimic a cartoon, and they played with Clark Kent sitting in the audience watching this movie with Lois Lane, and he's scared to death because he knows they're going to reveal Clark as Superman in a cartoon, and she's going to find out. So, a lot of humor there.
Played with the meta version of it just a little bit
That's
there.
right.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite Superman story or storyline?
Well, my favorite storyline over all these years is, the origin story is, which people have equated to the Moses story of Superman. Instead of Moses being sent down the Nile in a reed basket to be adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, you have Superman being sent in a rocket ship from the exploding planet Krypton to Earth to be adopted by the Kents. And I love the way, because of the great science fiction aspect, I always loved to see how they were going to portray the rocket. Eventually, they expanded on the origin story, and then they wrote about life on Krypton before it exploded. What did Superman's father do? Well, he turns out to be the planet's greatest scientist, but also a hero in his own right. And so I loved the architecture. Wayne Boring drew Eastern European style minarets to represent the futuristic buildings of Krypton. Each artist, that retold the origin had a different version, a different science fiction way of drawing the different aspects. There's the Scarlet Jungle on Krypton, and the Jewel Mountains, so these mountains that gleam, that are faceted. There's instead of a waterfall, there's a flaming fall, where flames instead of water. So that's my favorite aspect, were the science fiction aspects.
It's interesting because most of the time they depicted the rocket as a copy of the V2 that Germany used in World War II, with the fins on the back and a bullet shape on it. So a fascinating set. If people are interested, we got them. How would they get a hold of a copy of this?
Well, that's the problem. At this point, probably not until it will be published in Alter Ego. Again, I self-published a limited number of copies, but part of staying out of trouble with DC is I don't really have a price, and I don't really sell them. I wanted to print them so that the professionals that participated would have a copy, so that family members and friends that were interested would have a copy. So it's not currently for sale. I was tempted to put it at least as an online book on Amazon, but I don't think I'll do that at this point. The last potential publisher, was the one that DC wanted a large fee, and they couldn't justify printing it and paying DC all this money. They would have lost money on it. Yeah. So that's the bad thing. And that's why I'm so glad that Roy Thomas, who is editor of Alter Ego magazine that you mentioned, wants to publish this. So at least people will get the information eventually, but it'll be in magazine form.
We should explain that Alter Ego has been around for a long time. It's a very well-respected magazine in the industry. So, yeah.
Yes, and Roy contributed his thoughts about Wayne Boring to the book, and he actually kind of found Wayne Boring after the guy had been fired by DC Comics, and got him to do some Marvel comic stories, and then 15 years later got him to redraw the origin of Superman for DC in a story that Roy both wrote and edited. Secret Origins #1 was the name of the comic. So yeah, Roy's always been very, very supportive. And you're right, Alter Ego's been around a long, long time, and I've had the pleasure of writing some articles for him. So we know each other through that magazine.
I want to point out also that there's a nice comparison in there. The scene where Clark Kent is visiting the grave of his parents, and drawn by two different artists, well, at different times, and that redrawing of it, it's very interesting to see the different styles that were used there. And again, throughout the book. If there's anything that I've not touched on, you want to make sure our listeners know about.
Well, there are, a few things that I'm sure you enjoyed reading about, because, for instance, the patriotic Superman of World War II, and how on the covers, one cover has Germany's has Goebbels or Goebbels on it, and Superman's holding up by his collar on one side this Nazi, and then he's holding the Liberty Bell in the other. So, the artist that did those, that was not Joe Shuster. Those were artists. There were two hired directly by DC Comics, partly to do advertising because they thought in some ways they were better artists. So Fred Ray and Jack Burnley did not work for Joe Shuster directly. They were hired by the company, and they were known as the great patriotic Superman artist of World War II with these amazing covers. Wayne Boring did one cover that really stood out. In fact, it was him. That's right. It was him that did held up Goebbels, Superman holding up Goebbels in one hand and the Liberty Bell in the other. But Fred Ray's cover, one of the most famous Superman covers was Fred Ray's, and that's where Superman is behind a shield with the red, white, and blue, and there is an eagle on Superman's shoulder. And that cover's been redone over the decades by many other artists doing a more modern or their version.
And and you point out in there that cover did not have the Action Comics logo on it or Superman Comics logo on it. It was just that. It was like a poster.
Well, yeah, later on, actually after 9/11, they recreated that picture and gave it out free at comic book shops and elsewhere. As I said, just to make the country feel better. It was an amazing gesture on DC Comics' part, but they're using this Fred Ray drawing from 1942, I believe, after 9/11.
Yeah, we touched briefly on, I want to go in just a little bit more detail on how World War II affected all of this, because you had people going, getting enlisting or being drafted, and replacements, and it affected not only the actual production of it, but the subject matter.
Very much so. Superman started out more as a vigilante working outside the law. And, during World War II, he becomes much more entrenched. You could call it propaganda or whatever, but he is no longer a vigilante. He's working, behind the scenes to help the Allies in any way he can. And his character changes in that way. Yes, many of the artists served in World War II. Some of them, while they went off to war, other artists came in to replace them that maybe couldn't serve. Joe Shuster was not able to serve, with his bad eyesight and things. So he oversaw, got some new people in, as well as someone like John Cicala, who was a good friend of his, who came in again after the war and worked with Shuster. Cicala, by the way, went nearly deaf, very hard of hearing from his being next to some of the big artillery guns during World War II at the Battle of the Bulge. So again, these very interesting stories. One World War II veteran, one that wouldn't move back to New York when Shuster relocated there, went out to the California desert and eventually was known for saving desert tortoises that got hit by cars on the highways going through the desert. So, and another artist, Ira Yarbrough, had a nervous breakdown before he worked in comics from working for Rand McNally and having to draw maps. His specialty was Florida, and he drew Florida so many times it was so boring and unrewarding that his doctor said, "You have to quit for your health." And so he eventually came to draw Superman, and he formed his own toy company for a while. So all the backstories that I love to tell.
So where do we go from here? Is there a fourth book coming or a fourth collection?
Well, yes. The first book, Kurt Swan was raised as a Presbyterian. Al Plastino, great subject, talking about his Catholic upbringing and how that affected him and his love of art. Third book, 28 artists are profiled, many different religions. My fourth book will be about, it's tentatively called The Jewish, Almost Jewish, and Not So Jewish Cartoonist of the 20th Century. And it will be about, again, not just Jewish cartoonists, but those with themes that might be relevant. So I'm going to hit a third religion, so to speak.
We should mention also that the first two books are available on Amazon right now.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And I highly recommend them. I want to thank you for the time today. Our guest today has been Eddy Zeno. His latest publication is Wayne Boring and the Early Superman Artists Who Followed Joe Shuster. Highly recommend any of his work. And thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Roger.